Rachel and David moved as far away from the old house as they could. Their new home was in a different town, far from the suffocating presence of the shadowy figure, and they had chosen a modern apartment in a bustling area where the lights never went out and the streets were always alive with people. Rachel hoped this would bring her peace, and for a while it seemed to work. Life went back to normal, and the terror of that night began to fade into the background. But as the months passed, Rachel couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. It was subtle at first. The odd feeling of being watched when she was alone in the apartment, or the occasional chill that ran down her spine as she passed by the windows. She told herself it was just paranoia, the residual fear from what had happened. David, ever the rational one, assured her that it was all in her head. After all, they had moved far away, and the house had a new owner. The shadow was part of the past, he said. One night, Rachel was home alone again. David had gone on a business trip, leaving her to fend for herself in the quiet apartment. She had never liked being by herself at night, not after what had happened at the old house. Still, she tried to push those thoughts aside as she sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone to distract herself. The apartment was modern, filled with soft lighting and the sound of the city below. It was nothing like the creaky old house they had left behind. But as the hours crept on and the night grew deeper, Rachel began to feel that familiar sense of unease. She found herself glancing toward the windows more often than usual, as if expecting to see something standing on the other side of the glass. Around midnight, as she was getting ready to head to bed, Rachel heard a faint tapping sound. It was so soft that she almost dismissed it as her imagination. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was persistent, and it sent chills down her spine. The tapping was soft, rhythmic, and unmistakable. It was coming from the window in the living room. Each tap seemed to echo louder in the silence of the night. She turned slowly, her eyes locked on the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. At first there was nothing, just the dark city skyline beyond the glass. The city lights twinkled innocently, masking the terror that lay just beyond. But then, in the reflection of the city lights, she saw it, a shadow, faint and blurry, standing just outside the window. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form. It was tall and thin, its outline almost indistinguishable from the darkness. Rachel's heart raced, pounding in her chest like a drum. She blinked, hoping it was just her imagination, but when she looked again, the shadow was still there. It seemed more defined now, more real. It was closer now, as if it had moved while she wasn't looking. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding her attention. Panicking, Rachel backed away from the window. Her mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. She grabbed her phone and called David, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. Each ring felt like an eternity. The phone rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. Desperation clawed at her as she listened to the unanswered rings. He was probably asleep in his hotel room, unaware of the terror she was facing. She felt utterly alone. The tapping continued, growing louder. It was almost as if the shadow was trying to break through the glass. Rachel couldn't bring herself to look at the window again. The fear was paralyzing, gripping her entire being. She ran to the bedroom, locked the door, and huddled under the covers, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She felt a small sense of safety in the confined space. She texted David, begging him to call her as soon as he saw the message. Her fingers trembled as she typed out her plea. Hours passed and the tapping eventually stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the tapping had been. Exhausted and terrified, Rachel finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her body too drained to stay awake any longer. The night had taken its toll on her. The next morning when she woke up, the apartment was silent. The bright morning sun streamed through the windows, dispelling the shadows that had haunted her during the night. She hesitated before leaving the bedroom, half expecting to see the shadowy figure still lingering outside the window. But when she stepped into the living room, everything was normal. There was no sign of the shadow, no evidence that anything had been there. Rachel tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, a product of her overactive imagination, but deep down she knew better. Later that day, David called. She told him about the shadow, about the tapping at the window, and about her growing fear that it had followed them to their new home. David was concerned but skeptical. "Rach, I think you're still dealing with the trauma from the old house," he said. "Maybe you should talk to someone who can help you work through it. It's not real." Rachel wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the shadow was just a figment of her imagination. But it felt too real, too menacing to be a simple hallucination. Over the next few days, the apartment remained eerily quiet. No more tapping at the window, no more shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. Rachel began to relax, telling herself that David was right. The shadow hadn't followed them, it was just her mind playing tricks on her, feeding off her old fears. Then one evening, something happened that completely shattered any remaining sense of security. Rachel was in the bathroom getting ready for bed. She had just finished brushing her hair and was now washing her face, the cool water refreshing against her skin. She had just turned off the faucet when she heard a faint whisper, almost like a breath against her ear. At first, she thought it was the sound of the pipes or maybe the wind outside. She paused, listening intently, trying to catch the sound again, but then she heard it again. Closer this time, more distinct and unmistakable. Rachel. Her heart skipped a beat, the whisper sending chills down her spine. The voice was low and rasping, as if someone were standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. There was no one there. "Rachel!" The voice whispered again, this time from the hallway, more insistent and eerie. She grabbed the bathroom door and slammed it shut, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, she tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The voice hadn't been David's. It was too unfamiliar, too unsettling. It was something else, something she hadn't heard before, something that didn't belong. After what felt like hours, she finally opened the door and stepped cautiously into the hallway, her heart pounding. The apartment was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She moved slowly toward the living room, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, every nerve on edge. When she reached the window, she saw it. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't outside. It was inside the apartment, standing in the far corner of the living room. Its form was more distinct now, still tall and thin, but with long, spindly arms that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were two dark voids, blacker than the shadows that surrounded it. Rachel froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, oppressive and suffocating. It was watching her. For what felt like an eternity, Rachel stood there, unable to move. Then slowly the shadow began to shift, gliding toward her with unnatural grace. Its form flickered as if it were made of smoke, but its intent was clear. It was coming for her. With a surge of adrenaline, Rachel ran, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She grabbed her phone and dashed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her with a loud bang. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably, as the sound of footsteps echoed ominously from the living room. "Rachel!" The voice rasped again, now just outside the door, sending chills down her spine. She backed away, clutching her phone to her chest, her mind racing for a solution. There was no one to call, no one who would believe her frantic story. David was still out of town, and by the time he got back, it might be too late to save her. The doorknob rattled violently, and then Silence, an eerie, unsettling silence. Rachel stared at the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body trembling with fear. The footsteps had stopped, but she knew the shadow was still there, waiting, lurking. Just when she thought it might be over, a soft tapping sound began. Faint but unmistakable, sending her into a new wave of panic. It was coming from the window, inside the bedroom, the last place she thought she was safe.